Chapter 21 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 21. The week passed quickly for me, leaving but few definite impressions. As I look back to it now, I can see the long stretch of beach burning in the fierce sunlight, the endless meadows with the glimmer of water in the distance, the dunes, the twisted cedars, the leagues of scintillating ocean, rocking, rocking, always rocking. In the starlit nights, the curlew came in from the sandbars by twos and threes. I could hear their querulous call as I lay in bed thinking. All day long, the little ringnecks whistled from the shore. The plover answered them from distant, lonely inland pools. The great white gulls drifted like feathers upon the sea. One morning towards the end of the week, I, strolling along the dunes, came upon Frisbee. He was bill-posting. I caught him red-handed. "This," said I, "must stop. Do you understand, Mr. Frisbee?" He stepped back from his work, laying his head on one side, considering first me, then the bill that he had posted on one of our big boilers. "Don't you like the color?" he asked. "It goes well on them black boilers." "Color? No, I don't like the color either. Can't you understand that there are some people in the world who object to seeing patent medicine advertisements scattered over a landscape?" "Hey?" he said, perplexed. "Will you kindly remove that advertisement?" I persisted. "Too late," said Frisbee. "It's sought." I was too disgusted to speak, but my disgust turned to anger when I perceived that, as far as the eye could reach, our boilers, lying from 300 to 400 feet apart, were ablaze with yellow and red posters extolling the Eureka Liver Pill Company. "It don't cost him nothin'," said Frisbee cheerfully. "I done it for the fun of it. Pretty, ain't it?" "They are Professor Holroyd's boilers," I said, subduing a desire to beat Frisbee with my telescope. "Wait until Miss Holroyd sees this work." "Don't she like yeller and red?" he demanded anxiously. "You'll find out," said I. Frisbee gaped at his handiwork, and then at his yellow dog. After a moment he mechanically spat on a clamshell and requested Davy to sick it. "Can't you comprehend that you have ruined our pleasure in the landscape?" I asked more mildly. "I've got some green bills," said Frisbee. "I can stick 'em over the yeller ones." "Confound it," said I. "It isn't the color." "Then," observed Frisbee, "you don't like them pills. I've got some bills of the Cropper automobile and a few of Bagley, the gent's tailor." "Frisbee," said I, "use them all. Paste the whole collection over your dog and yourself, then walk off the cliff." He sullenly unfolded a green poster, swabbed the boiler with paste, laid the upper section of the bill upon it, and plastered the whole bill down with a thwack of his brush. As I walked away, I heard him muttering. Next day, Daisy was so horrified that I promised to give Frisbee an ultimatum. I found him with Freda, gazing sentimentally at his work, and I sent him back to the shop in a hurry, telling Freda at the same time that she could spend her leisure in providing Mr. Frisbee with sand, soap, and a scrubbing brush. Then I walked on to my post of observation. I watched until sunset. Daisy came with her father to hear my report, but there was nothing to tell, and we three walked slowly back to the house. In the evenings, the professor worked on his volumes, the click of his typewriter sounding faintly behind his closed door. Daisy and I played chess sometimes. Sometimes we played hearts. I don't remember that we ever finished a game of either. We talked too much. Our discussions covered every topic of interest. We argued upon politics. We skimmed over literature and music. We settled international differences. We spoke vaguely of human brotherhood. I say we slighted no subject of interest. I am wrong. We never spoke of love. Now, love is a matter of interest to 10 people out of 10. Why it was that it did not appear to interest us is as interesting a question as love itself. We were young, alert, enthusiastic, inquiring. We eagerly absorbed theories concerning any curious phenomena in nature as intellectual cocktails to stimulate discussion. And yet we did not discuss love. I do not say that we avoided it. No, the subject was too completely ignored for even that. And yet we found it very difficult to pass an hour separated. The professor noticed this and laughed at us. We were not even embarrassed. Sunday passed in pious contemplation of the ocean. Daisy read a little in her prayer book, and the professor threw a cloth over his typewriter and strolled up and down the sands. He may have been lost in devout abstraction. He may have been looking for footprints. As for me, my mind was very serene, and I was more than happy. Daisy read to me a little for my soul's sake, and the professor came up and said something cheerful. He also examined the magazine of my Winchester. That night, too, Daisy took her guitar to the sands and sang one or two Basque hymns. Unlike us, the Basques do not take their pleasure sadly. One of their pleasures is evidently religion. The big moon came up over the dunes and stared at the sea until the surface of every wave trembled with radiance. A sudden stillness fell across the world. The wind died out. The foam ran noiselessly across the beach. The cricket's rune was stilled. I leaned back, dropping one hand upon the sand. It touched another hand, soft and cool. After a while, the other hand moved slightly, and I found that my own had closed above it. Presently, one finger stirred a little, only a little, for our fingers were interlocked. On the shore, the foam froth bubbled and winked and glimmered in the moonlight. A star fell from the zenith, showering the night with incandescent dust. If our fingers lay interlaced beside us, her eyes were calm and serene as always, wide open, fixed upon the depths of a dark sky. And when her father rose and spoke to us, she did not withdraw her hand. "Is it late?" she asked dreamily. "It is midnight, little daughter." I stood up, still holding her hand, and aided her to rise. And when, at the door, I said good night, she turned and looked at me for a little while in silence, then passed into her room slowly, with head still turned towards me. All night long I dreamed of her, and when the east widened, I sprang up, the thunder of the ocean in my ears, the strong sea wind blowing into the open window. She's asleep, I thought, and I leaned from the window and peered out into the east. The sea called to me, tossing its 1,000 arms. The soaring gulls, dipping, rising, wheeling above the sandbar, screamed and clamored for a playmate. I slipped into my bathing suit, dropped from the window upon the soft sand, and in a moment had plunged head foremost into the surf, swimming beneath the waves towards the open sea. Under the tossing ocean, the voice of the waters was in my ears, a low, sweet voice, intimate, mysterious. Through singing foam and broad green glassy depths, by whispering sandy channels a trail with seaweed, and on, out into the vague, cool sea, I sped, rising to the top, sinking, gliding. Then at last I flung myself out of water, hands raised, and the clamor of the gulls filled my ears. As I lay, breathing fast, drifting on the sea, far out beyond the gulls, I saw a flash of white, and an arm was lifted, signaling me. "Daisy!" I called. A clear hail came across the water, distinct on the sea wind, and at the same instant we raised our hands and moved towards each other. How we laughed as we met in the sea! The white dawn came up out of the depths, the zenith turned to rose and ashes. And with the dawn came the wind, a great sea wind, fresh, aromatic, that hurled our voices back into our throats and lifted the sheeted spray above our heads. Every wave, crowned with mist, caught us in a cool embrace, cradled us and slipped away, only to leave us to another wave, higher, stronger, crested with opalescent glory, breathing incense. We turned together up the coast, swimming lightly side by side, but our words were caught up by the winds and whirled into the sky. We looked up at the driving clouds. We looked out upon the pallid waste of waters. But it was into each other's eyes we looked, wondering, wistful, questioning the reason of sky and sea. And there in each other's eyes we read the mystery, and we knew that earth and sky and sea were created for us alone. Drifting on by distant sands and dunes, her white fingers touching mine, we spoke, keying our tones to the wind's vast harmony. And we spoke of love. Gray and wide as the limitless span of the sky and the sea, the winds gathered from the world's ends to bear us on. But they were not familiar winds, for now along the coast the breakers curled and showed a million fangs, and the ocean stirred to its depths, uneasy, ominous, and the menace of its murmur drew us closer as we moved. Where the dull thunder and the tossing spray warned us from sunken reefs, we heard the harsh challenges of gulls. Where the pallid surf twisted in yellow coils of spume above the bar, the singing sands murmured of treachery and secrets of lost souls, agasp in the throes of silent undertows. But there was a little stretch of beach glimmering through the mountains of water, and towards this we turned, side by side. Around us the water grew warmer. The breath of the following waves moistened our cheeks. The water itself grew gray and strange about us. "We have come too far," I said, but she only answered, "Faster, faster, I am afraid." The water was almost hot now. Its aromatic odor filled our lungs. "The Gulf Loop," I muttered. "Daisy, shall I help you?" "No, swim. Close by me. Oh, Dick!" Her startled cry was echoed by another, a shrill scream unutterably horrible, and a great bird flapped from the beach, splashing and beating its pinions across the water with a thundering noise. Out across the waves it blundered, rising little by little from the water. And now, to my horror, I saw another monstrous bird swinging in the air above it, squealing as it turned on its vast wings. Before I could speak, we touched the beach, and I half lifted her to the shore. "Quick!" I repeated. "We must not wait." Her eyes were dark with fear, but she rested a hand on my shoulder, and we crept up among the dune grasses and sank down by the point of sand, where the rough shelter stood, surrounded by the iron-ringed piles. She lay there, breathing fast and deep, dripping with spray. I had no power of speech left, but when I rose wearily to my knees and looked out upon the water, my blood ran cold. Above the ocean, on the breast of the roaring wind, 3 enormous birds sailed, turning and wheeling among one another. And below, drifting with the grey stream of the Gulf Loop, a colossal bulk lay half submerged, a gigantic lizard floating belly upward. Then Daisy crept kneeling to my side and touched me, trembling from head to foot. "I know," I muttered. "I must run back for the rifle." And leave me?" I took her by the hand, and we dragged ourselves through the wire grass to the open end of a boiler lying in the sand. She crept in on her hands and knees and called to me to follow. "You are safe now," I cried. "I must go back for the rifle." "The birds may attack you." "If they do, I can get into one of the other boilers," I said. "Daisy, you must not venture out until I come back. You won't, will you?" "No," she whispered doubtfully. "Then goodbye." "Goodbye," she answered, but her voice was very small and still. "Goodbye," I said again. I was kneeling at the mouth of the big iron tunnel. It was dark inside, and I could not see her. But before I was conscious of it, her arms were around my neck, and we had kissed each other. I don't remember how I went away. When I came to my proper senses, I was swimming along the coast at full speed, and over my head wheeled one of the birds, screaming at every turn. The intoxication of that innocent embrace, the close impress of her arms around my neck, gave me a strength and recklessness that neither fear nor fatigue could subdue. The bird above me did not even frighten me. I watched it over my shoulder, swimming strongly, with the tide now aiding me, now stemming my course. But I saw the shore passing quickly, and my strength increased, and I shouted when I came in sight of the house, and scrambled up on the sand, dripping and excited. There was nobody in sight, and I gave a last glance up into the air where the bird wheeled, still screeching, and hastened into the house. Freda stared at me in amazement as I seized the rifle and shouted for the professor. "He has gone to town with Captain McPeak in his wagon," stammered Freda. "What?" I cried. "Does he know where his daughter is?" "Miss Holroyd is asleep. Not?" gasped Freda. "Where's Frisbee?" I cried impatiently. "Yimmy," quavered Freda. "Yes, Jimmy. Isn't there anybody here? Good heavens, where's that man in the shop?" "He also is gone," said Freda, shedding tears, "to buy papier-mâché. Yimmy, he is gone to post bills." I waited to hear no more, but swung my rifle over my shoulder, and hanging the cartridge belt across my chest, hurried out and up the beach. The bird was not in sight. I had been running for perhaps a minute when, far up on the dunes, I saw a yellow dog rush madly through a clump of sweet bay, and at the same moment a bird soared past, rose, and hung hovering just above the thicket. Suddenly the bird swooped. There was a shriek and a yelp from the cur, but the bird gripped it in one claw and beat its wings upon the sand, striving to rise. Then I saw Frisbee, paste, bucket, and brush raised, fall upon the bird, yelling lustily. The fierce creature relaxed its talons, and the dog rushed on, squeaking with terror. The bird turned on Frisbee and sent him sprawling on his face, a sticky mass of paste and sand. But this did not end the struggle. The bird, croaking horridly, flew at the prostrate bill-poster, and the sand whirled into a pillar above its terrible wings. Scarcely knowing what I was about, I raised my rifle and fired twice. A scream echoed each shot, and the bird rose heavily in a shower of sand. But 2 bullets were embedded in that mass of foul feathers, and I saw the wires and scarlet tape uncoiling on the sand at my feet. In an instant I seized them and passed the ends around a cedar tree, hooking the clasps tight. Then I cast one swift glance upward, where the bird wheeled, screeching, anchored like a kite to the pallium wires. And I hurried on across the dunes, the shells cutting my feet and the bushes tearing my wet swimming suit, until I dripped with blood from shoulder to ankle. Out in the ocean, the carcass of the Thermosaurus floated, claws outspread, belly glistening in the gray light, and over him circled 2 birds. As I reached the shelter, I knelt and fired into the mass of scales, and at my first shot, a horrible thing occurred. The lizard-like head writhed, the slitted yellow eyes sliding open from the film that covered them. A shudder passed across the undulating body, the great scaled belly heaved, and one leg feebly clawed at the air. The thing was still alive. Crushing back the horror that almost paralyzed my hands, I planted shot after shot into the quivering reptile, while it writhed and clawed, striving to turn over and dive. And at each shot, the black blood spurted in long slim jets across the water. And now Daisy was at my side, pale and determined, swiftly clasping each taped-marked wire to the iron rings in the circle around us. Twice I filled the magazine from my belt, and twice I poured streams of steel-tipped bullets into the scaled mass, twisting and shuddering on the sea. Suddenly the birds steered towards us. I felt the wind from their vast wings. I saw the feathers erect, vibrating. I saw the spread claws outstretched, and I struck furiously at them, crying to Daisy to run into the iron shelter. Backing, swinging my clubbed rifle, I retreated, but I tripped across one of the taut pallium wires, and in an instant the hideous birds were on me, and the bone in my forearm snapped like a pipe stem at a blow from their wings. Twice I struggled to my knees, blinded with blood, confused, almost fainting. Then I fell again, rolling into the mouth of the iron boiler. When I struggled back to consciousness, Daisy knelt silently beside me, while Captain McPeak and Professor Holroyd bound up my shattered arm, talking excitedly. The pain made me feel faint and dizzy. I tried to speak and could not. At last they got me to my feet and into the wagon, and Daisy came too and crouched beside me, wrapped in oilskins to her eyes. Fatigue, lack of food, and excitement had combined with wounds and broken bones to extinguish the last atom of strength in my body, but my mind was clear enough to understand that the trouble was over and the Thermosaurus safe. I heard McPeak say that one of the birds that I had anchored to a cedar tree had torn loose from the bullets and had winged its way heavily out to sea. The professor answered, "Yes, the echalf bird. The others were ool ilex. I'd have given my right arm to have secured them." Then for a time I heard no more, but the jolting of the wagon over the dunes roused me to keenest pain. I held out my right hand to Daisy. She clasped it in both of hers, and kissed it again and again. There is little more to add, I think. Professor Bruce Stoddard's scientific pamphlet will be published soon, to be followed by Professor Holroyd's 16 volumes. In a few days, the stuffed and mounted Thermosaurus will be placed on free public exhibition in the arena of Madison Square Garden, the only building in the city large enough to contain the body of this immense winged reptile. The young man hesitated, looking long and earnestly at Miss Barrison. "Did you marry her?" she asked softly. "You wouldn't believe it," said the young man earnestly. "You wouldn't believe it after all that happened, if I should tell you that she married Professor Bruce Stoddard of Columbia. Would you?" "Yes, I would," said Miss Barrison. "You never can tell what a girl will do." "That story of yours," I said, "is to me the most wonderful and valuable contribution to nature study that it has ever been my fortune to listen to. You are fitted to write. It is your sacred mission to produce. Are you going to?" "I am writing," said the young man quietly, "a nature book. Sir Peter Greaves' magnificent monograph on the speckled titmouse inspired me. But nature study is not what I have chosen as my life's mission." He looked dreamily across at Miss Barrison. "No, not natural phenomena," he repeated, "but unnatural phenomena. What Professor Hyssop has done for Columbia, I shall attempt to do for Harvard. In fact, I have already accepted the chair of psychical phenomena at Cambridge." I gazed upon him with intense respect. "A personal experience revealed to me my life's work," he went on, thoughtfully stroking his blond moustache. "If Miss Barrison would care to hear it." "Please tell it," she said sweetly. "I shall have to relate it clothed in that artificial garb known as literary style," he explained deprecatingly. "It doesn't matter," I said. "I never noticed any style at all in your story of the Thermosaurus." He smiled gratefully and passed his hand over his face. A faraway expression came into his eyes, and he slowly began, hesitating, as though talking to himself. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 22. It was high noon in the city of Antwerp. From slender steeples floated the mellow music of the Flemish bells, and in the spire of the great cathedral across the square the cracked chimes clashed discords until my ears ached. When the fiend in the cathedral had jerked the last tuneless clang from the chimes, I removed my fingers from my ears and sat down at one of the iron tables in the court. A waiter, with his face shaved blue, brought me a bottle of Rhine wine, a tumbler of cracked ice, and a siphon. "Does monsieur desire anything else?" he inquired. "Yes, the head of the cathedral bell-ringer. Bring it with vinegar and potatoes," I said bitterly. Then I began to ponder on my great-aunt and the crimson diamond. The white walls of the Hôtel Saint-Antoine rose in a rectangle around the sunny court, casting long shadows across the basin of the fountain. The strip of blue overhead was cloudless. Sparrows twittered under the eaves, the yellow awnings fluttered. The flowers swayed in the summer breeze, and the jet of the fountain splashed among the water plants. On the sunny side of the piazza, the tables were vacant. On the shady side, I was lazily aware that the tables behind me were occupied, but I was indifferent as to their occupants, partly because I shunned all tourists, partly because I was thinking of my great-aunt. Most old ladies are eccentric, but there is a limit, and my great-aunt had overstepped it. I had believed her to be wealthy. She died bankrupt. Still, I knew there was one thing she did possess, and that was the famous crimson diamond. Now, of course, you know who my great-aunt was. Excepting the Koh-i-Noor and the Regent, this enormous and unique stone was, as everybody knows, the most valuable gem in existence. Any ordinary person would have placed that diamond in a safe deposit. My great-aunt did nothing of the kind. She kept it in a small velvet bag, which she carried about her neck. She never took it off, but wore it dangling openly on her heavy silk gown. In the same bag she also carried dried catnip leaves, of which she was inordinately fond. Nobody but myself, her only living relative, knew that the crimson diamond lay among the sprigs of catnip in the little velvet bag. "Harold," she would say, "do you think I'm a fool? If I place the crimson diamond in any safe deposit vault in New York, somebody will steal it sooner or later." Then she would nibble a sprig of catnip and peer cunningly at me. I loathed the odor of catnip, and she knew it. I also loathed cats. This also she knew, and of course surrounded herself with a dozen. Poor old lady! One day she was found dead in her bed in her apartments at the Waldorf. The doctor said she died from natural causes. The only other occupant of her sleeping room was a cat. The cat fled when we broke open the door, and I heard that she was received and cherished by some eccentric people in a neighboring apartment. Now, although my great-aunt's death was due to purely natural causes, there was one very startling and disagreeable feature of the case. The velvet bag containing the crimson diamond had disappeared. Every inch of the apartment was searched, the floors torn up, the walls dismantled, but the crimson diamond had vanished. Chief of Police Conlon detailed 4 of his best men on the case, and as I had nothing better to do, I enrolled myself as a volunteer. I also offered $25,000 reward for the recovery of the gem. All New York was agog. The case seemed hopeless enough, although there were 5 of us after the thief. Macfarlane was in London, and had been for a month, but Scotland Yard could give him no help, and the last I heard of him he was roaming through Surrey after a man with a white spot in his hair. Harrison had gone to Paris. He kept writing me that clues were plenty and the scent hot, but as Denay in Berlin and Clancy in Vienna wrote me the same thing, I began to doubt these gentlemen's ability. "You say," I answered Harrison, "that the fellow is a Frenchman, and that he is now concealed in Paris. But Denay writes me by the same mail that the thief is undoubtedly a German, and was seen yesterday in Berlin. Today I received a letter from Clancy, assuring me that Vienna holds the culprit, and that he is an Austrian from Trieste. Now, for heaven's sake," I ended, "let me alone, and stop writing me letters until you have something to write about." The night clerk at the Waldorf had furnished us with our first clue. On the night of my aunt's death, he had seen a tall, grave-faced man hurriedly leave the hotel. As the man passed the desk, he removed his hat and mopped his forehead, and the night clerk noticed that in the middle of his head there was a patch of hair as white as snow. We worked this clue for all it was worth, and a month later I received a cable despatch from Paris, saying that a man answering to the description of the Waldorf suspect had offered an enormous crimson diamond for sale to a jeweler in the Palais Royal. Unfortunately, the fellow took fright and disappeared before the jeweler could send for the police, and since that time Macfarlane in London, Harrison in Paris, Denay in Berlin, and Clancy in Vienna had been chasing men with white patches on their hair, until no grey-headed patriarch in Europe was free from suspicion. I myself had sleuthed it through England, France, Holland, and Belgium, and now I found myself in Antwerp, at the Hôtel Saint-Antoine, without a clue that promised anything, except another outrage on some respectable white-haired citizen. The case seemed hopeless enough, unless the thief tried again to sell the gem. Here was our only hope, for unless he cut the stone into smaller ones, he had no more chance of selling it than he would have had if he had stolen the Venus of Milo and peddled her about the Rue de Seine. Even were he to cut up the stone, no respectable gem collector or jeweler would buy a crimson diamond without first notifying me. For although a few red stones are known to collectors, the color of the crimson diamond was absolutely unique, and there was little probability of an honest mistake. Thinking of all these things, I sat sipping my Rhine wine in the shadow of the yellow awnings. A large white cat came sauntering by, and stopped in front of me to perform her toilet, until I wished she would go away. After a while she sat up, licked her whiskers, yawned once or twice, and was about to stroll on, when catching sight of me, she stopped short and looked me squarely in the face. I returned the attention with a scowl, because I wished to discourage any advances towards social intercourse which she might contemplate. But after a while her steady gaze disconcerted me, and I turned to my Rhine wine. A few minutes later I looked up again. The cat was still eyeing me. "Now what the devil is the matter with the animal?" I muttered. "Does she recognize in me a relative?" "Perhaps," observed a man at the next table. "What do you mean by that?" I demanded. "What I say," replied the man at the next table. I looked him full in the face. He was old and bald and appeared weak-minded. His age protected his impudence. I turned my back on him. Then my eyes fell on the cat again. She was still gazing earnestly at me. Disgusted that she should take such pointed public notice of me, I wondered whether other people saw it. I wondered whether there was anything peculiar in my own personal appearance. How hard the creature stared! It was most embarrassing. "What has got into that cat?" I thought. "It's sheer impudence. It's an intrusion, and I won't stand it." The cat did not move. I tried to stare her out of countenance. It was useless. There was aggressive inquiry in her yellow eyes. A sensation of uneasiness began to steal over me, a sensation of embarrassment not unmixed with awe. All cats looked alike to me, and yet there was something about this one that bothered me, something that I could not explain to myself, but which began to occupy me. She looked familiar, this Antwerp cat. An odd sense of having seen her before, of having been well acquainted with her in former years, slowly settled in my mind. And although I could never remember the time when I had not detested cats, I was almost convinced that my relations with this Antwerp tabby had once been intimate, if not cordial. I looked more closely at the animal. Then an idea struck me, an idea which persisted and took definite shape in spite of me. I strove to escape from it, to evade it, to stifle and smother it. An inward struggle ensued, which brought the perspiration in beads upon my cheeks. A struggle short, sharp, decisive. It was useless to try to put it from me. This idea, so wretchedly bizarre, so grotesque and fantastic, so utterly inane. It was useless to deny that the cat bore a distinct resemblance to my great-aunt. I gazed at her in horror. What enormous eyes the creature had! "Blood is thicker than water," said the man at the next table. "What does he mean by that?" I muttered angrily, swallowing a tumbler of Rhine wine and seltzer. But I did not turn. What was the use? "Chattering old imbecile," I added to myself, and struck a match, for my cigar was out. But as I raised the match to relight it, I encountered the cat's eyes again. I could not enjoy my cigar with the animal staring at me, but I was justly indignant, and I did not intend to be routed. "The idea! Forced to leave for a cat!" I sneered. "We will see who will be the one to go." I tried to give her a jet of seltzer from the siphon, but the bottle was too nearly empty to carry far. Then I attempted to lure her nearer, calling her in French, German, and English, but she did not stir. I did not know the Flemish for cat. "She's got a name and won't come," I thought. "Now what under the sun can I call her?" "Auntie," suggested the man at the next table. I sat perfectly still. Could that man have answered my thoughts? For I had not spoken aloud. Of course not. It was a coincidence, but a very disgusting one. "Auntie," I repeated mechanically. "Auntie, auntie. Good gracious, how horribly human that cat looks." Then, somehow or other, Shakespeare's words crept into my head, and I found myself repeating, "The soul of my grandam might haply inhabit a bird, the soul of—" "Nonsense!" I growled. "It isn't printed correctly. One might possibly say, speaking in poetical metaphor, that the soul of a bird might haply inhabit one's grandam." I stopped short, flushing painfully. "What awful rot!" I murmured, and lighted another cigar. The cat was still staring. The cigar went out. I grew more and more nervous. "What rot!" I repeated. "Pythagoras must have been an ass, but I do believe there are plenty of asses alive today who swallow that sort of thing." "Who knows?" sighed the man at the next table, and I sprang to my feet and wheeled about. But I only caught a glimpse of a pair of frayed coat-tails and a bald head vanishing into the dining-room. I sat down again, thoroughly indignant. A moment later, the cat got up and went away. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 23. Daylight was fading in the city of Antwerp. Down into the sea sank the sun, tinting the vast horizon with flakes of crimson, and touching with rich, deep undertones the tossing waters of the Scheldt. Its glow fell like a rosy mantle over red-tiled roofs and meadows, and through the haze the spires of 20 churches pierced the air like sharp gilded flames. To the west and south, the green plains, over which the Spanish armies tramped so long ago, stretched away until they met the sky. The enchantment of the afterglow had turned old Antwerp into fairyland, and sea and sky and plain were beautiful and vague as the night mists floating in the moats below. Along the sea-wall from the Rubens Gate, all Antwerp strolled and chattered and flirted and sipped their Flemish wines from slender Flemish glasses, or gossiped over krugs of foaming beer. From the Scheldt came the cries of sailors, the creaking of cordage, and the puff-puff of the ferry-boats. On the bastions of the fortress opposite, a bugler was standing. Twice the mellow notes of the bugle came faintly over the water. Then a great gun thundered from the ramparts, and the Belgian flag fluttered along the lanyards to the ground. I leaned listlessly on the sea-wall and looked down at the Scheldt below. A battery of artillery was embarking for the fortress. The tub-like transport lay hissing and whistling in the slip, and the stamping of horses, the rumbling of guns and caisson, and the sharp cries of the officers came plainly to the ear. When the last caisson was aboard and stowed, and the last trooper had sprung jingling to the deck, the transport puffed out into the Scheldt, and I turned away through the throng of promenaders, and found a little table on the terrace, just outside of the pretty cafe. And as I sat down, I became aware of a girl at the next table, a girl all in white, the most ravishingly and distractingly pretty girl that I had ever seen. In the agitation of the moment, I forgot my name, my fortune, my aunt, and the crimson diamond. All these I forgot in a purely human impulse to see clearly, and to that end I removed my monocle from my left eye. Some moments later I came to myself and feebly replaced it. It was too late. The mischief was done. I was not aware, at first, of the exact state of my feelings, for I had never been in love more than 3 or 4 times in all my life. But I did know that at her request I would have been proud to stand on my head or turn a flip-flap into the Scheldt. I did not stare at her, but I managed to see her most of the time when her eyes were in another direction. I found myself drinking something which a waiter brought, presumably upon an order which I did not remember having given. Later I noticed that it was a loathsome drink which the Belgians call American grog, but I swallowed it and lighted a cigarette. As the fragrant cloud rose in the air, a voice, which I recognized with a chill, broke into my dream of enchantment. Could he have been there all the while, there sitting beside that vision in white? His hat was off, and the ocean breezes whispered about his bald head. His frayed coat-tails were folded carefully over his knees, and between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand he balanced a bad cigar. He looked at me in a mildly cheerful way and said, "I know now." "Know what?" I asked, thinking it better to humor him, for I was convinced that he was mad. "I know why cats bite." This was startling. I hadn't an idea what to say. "I know why," he repeated. "Can you guess why?" There was a covert tone of triumph in his voice, and he smiled encouragement. "Come, try and guess," he urged. I told him that I was unequal to problems. "Listen, young man," he continued, folding his coat-tails closely about his legs. "Try to reason it out. Why should cats bite? Don't you know? I do." He looked at me anxiously. "You take no interest in this problem?" he demanded. "Oh, yes." "Then why do you not ask me?" he said, looking vaguely disappointed. "Well," I said in desperation, "why do cats bite? Hang it all," I thought, "it's like a burned cork show, and I'm Mr. Bones and he's Tambo." Then he smiled gently. "Young man," he said, "cats bite because they feed on catnip. I have reasoned it out." I stared at him in blank astonishment. Was this benevolent-looking old party poking fun at me? Was he paying me up for the morning snub? Was he a malignant and revengeful old party, or was he merely feeble-minded? Who might he be? What was he doing here in Antwerp? What was he doing now? For the bald one had turned familiarly to the beautiful girl in white. "Wilhelmina," he said, "do you feel chilly?" The girl shook her head. "Not in the least, Papa." Her father, I thought. Her father! Thank God she did not say pauper. "I have been to the zoo today," announced the bald one, turning towards me. Indeed," I observed. I trust you enjoyed it." "I have been contemplating the apes," he continued dreamily. "Yes, contemplating the apes." I tried to look interested. Yes, the apes, he murmured, fixing his mild eyes on me. Then he leaned towards me confidentially and whispered, "Can you tell me what a monkey thinks?" "I cannot," I replied sharply. "Ah," he sighed, sinking back in his chair and patting the slender hand of the girl beside him. "Ah, who can tell what a monkey thinks?" His gentle face lulled my suspicions, and I replied very gravely, "Who can tell whether they think at all?" "True, true. Who can tell whether they think at all? And if they do think, who can tell what they think?" "But," I began, "if you can't tell whether they think at all, what's the use of trying to conjecture what they would think if they did think?" He raised his hand in deprecation. It is exactly that which is of such absorbing interest. Exactly that. It is the abstruseness of the proposition which stimulates research, which stirs profoundly the brain of the thinking world. The question is of vital and instant importance. Possibly you have already formed an opinion." I admitted that I had thought but little on the subject. "I doubt," he continued, swathing his knees in his coat-tails, "I doubt whether you have given much attention to the subject lately discussed by the Boston Dodo Society of Pythagorean Research." "I am not sure," I said politely, "that I recall that particular discussion. May I ask what was the question brought up?" "The Felis Domestica question." That must indeed be interesting. And, what may be the Felis Domestica, not dodo. Felis domestica, the common or garden cat." "Indeed," I murmured. "You are not listening," he said. I only half heard him. I could not turn my eyes from his daughter's face. "Cat!" shouted the bald one, and I almost leapt from my chair. "Are you deaf?" he inquired sympathetically. "No, oh, no," I replied, coloring with confusion. Pardon me, you were, speaking of the dodo. Extraordinary bird, that." "I was not discussing the dodo," he sighed. "I was speaking of cats." "Of course," I said. "The question is," he continued, twisting his frayed coat-tails into a sort of rope, "the question is, how are we to ameliorate the present condition and social status of our domestic cats?" "Feed 'em," I suggested. He raised both hands. They were eloquent with patient expostulation. "I mean their spiritual condition," he said. I nodded, but my eyes reverted to that exquisite face. She sat silent, her eyes fixed on the waning flecks of color in the western sky. "Yes," repeated the bald one, "the spiritual welfare of our domestic cats." "Toms and tabbies," I murmured. "Exactly," he said, tying a large knot in his coat-tails. "You will ruin your coat," I observed. "Papa!" exclaimed the girl, turning in dismay, as that gentleman gave a guilty start. "Stop it at once!" He smiled apologetically, and made a feeble attempt to conceal his coat-tails. "My dear," he said with gentle deprecation, "I am so absent-minded. I always do it in the heat of argument." The girl rose, and bending over her untidy parent, deftly untied the knot in his flapping coat. When he was disentangled, she sat down and said, with a ghost of a smile, "He is so very absent-minded." "Your father is evidently a great student," I ventured pleasantly. How I pitied her, tied to this old lunatic. Yes, he is a great student, she said quietly. I am, he murmured. That's what makes me so absent-minded. I often go to bed and forget to sleep. Then, looking at me, he asked me my name, adding with a bow that his was P. Royal Wyeth, Professor of Pythagorean Research and Abstruse Paradox. My first name is Penny, named after Professor Penny of Harvard, he said, but I seldom use my first name in connection with my second, as the combination suggests a household remedy of penetrating odor. My name is Kensett, I said, Harold Kensett of New York. Student? A little. Student of diamonds. I smiled. Oh, I see you know who my great-aunt was, I said. I know her, he said. Ah, perhaps you are unaware that my great-aunt is not now living. I know her, he repeated obstinately. I bowed. What a crank he was. What do you study? You don't fiddle away all your time, do you? He asked. Now, that was just what I did, but I was not pleased to have Miss Wyeth know it. Although my time was chiefly spent in killing time, I had once, in a fit of energy, succeeded in writing some verses to a tomtit, so I evaded a humiliating confession by saying that I had done a little work in ornithology. Good, cried the professor, beaming all over. I knew you were a fellow scientist. Possibly you are a brother member of the Boston Dodo Society of Pythagorean Research. Are you a dodo? I shook my head. No, I am not a dodo. Only a jay? What? I said angrily. A jay. We call them members of the Junior Ornithological Jay Society of New York, jays, just as we refer to ourselves as dodos. Are you not even a jay? I am not, I said, watching him suspiciously. I must convert you, I see, said the professor, smiling. I am afraid I do not approve of Pythagorean research, I began, but the beautiful Miss Wyeth turned to me very seriously, and looking me frankly in the eyes, said, I trust you will be open to conviction. Good Lord, I thought, can she be another lunatic? I looked at her steadily. What a little beauty she was! She also, then, belonged to the Pythagoreans, a sect I despised. Everybody knows all about the Pythagorean craze, its rise in Boston, its rapid spread, and its subsequent consolidation with mental and Christian Science, Theosophy, hypnotism, the Salvation Army, the Shakers, the Dunkers, and the Mind-Cure cult, upon a business basis. I had hitherto regarded all Pythagoreans with the same scornful indifference which I afforded to the faith-curists. Being a member of no particular church, I was scarcely prepared to take any of them seriously. Least of all did I approve of the business basis, and I looked very much askance indeed at the Scientific and Religious Trust Company, duly incorporated and generally known as the Pythagorean Trust, which, consolidating with mind-curists, faith-curists, and other flourishing salvation syndicates, actually claimed a place among ordinary trusts, and at the same time pretended to a control over man's future life. No, I could never listen. I was ashamed of even entertaining the notion, and I shook my head. No, Miss Wyeth, I am afraid I do not care to listen to any reasoning on this subject. Don't you believe in Pythagoras? Demanded the professor, subduing his excitement with difficulty, and adding another knot to his coat-tails. No, I said, I do not. How do you know you don't? Inquired the professor. Because, I said firmly, it is nonsense to say that the soul of a human being can inhabit a hen. Put it in a more simplified form, insisted the professor. Do you believe that the soul of a hen can inhabit a human being? No, I don't. Did you ever hear of a hen-pecked man? Cried the professor, his voice ending in a shout. I nodded, intensely annoyed. Will you listen to reason, then? He continued eagerly. No, I began, but I caught Miss Wyeth's blue eyes fixed on mine, with an expression so sad, so sweetly appealing, that I faltered. Yes, I will listen, I said faintly. Will you become my pupil? Insisted the professor. I was shocked to find myself wavering, but my eyes were looking into hers, and I could not disobey what I read there. The longer I looked, the greater inclination I felt to waver. I saw that I was going to give in, and strangest of all, my conscience did not trouble me. I felt it coming. A sort of mild exhilaration took possession of me. For the first time in my life, I became reckless. I even gloried in my recklessness. Yes, yes, I cried, leaning eagerly across the table. I shall be glad, delighted. Will you take me as your pupil? My single eyeglass fell from its position unheeded. Take me! Oh, will you take me? I cried. Instead of answering, the professor blinked rapidly at me for a moment. I imagined his eyes had grown bigger and were assuming a greenish tinge. The corners of his mouth began to quiver, emitting queer, caressing little noises, and he rapidly added knot after knot to his twitching coat-tails. Suddenly, he bent forward across the table until his nose almost touched mine. The pupils of his eyes expanded, the iris assuming a beautiful, changing, golden-green tinge, and his coat-tails switched violently. Then he began to mew. I strove to rouse myself from my paralysis. I tried to shrink back, for I felt the end of his cold nose touch mine. I could not move. The cry of terror died in my straining throat. My hands tightened convulsively. I was incapable of speech or motion. At the same time, my brain became wonderfully clear. I began to remember everything that had ever happened to me, everything that I had ever done or said. I even remembered things that I had neither done nor said. I recalled distinctly much that had never happened. How fresh and strong my memory! The past was like a mirror, crystal clear, and there, in glorious tints and hues, the scenes of my childhood grew and glowed and faded, and gave place to newer and more splendid scenes. For a moment, the episode of the cat at the Hôtel Saint-Antoine flashed across my mind. When it vanished, a chilly stupor slowly clouded my brain. The scenes, the memories, the brilliant colors faded, leaving me enveloped in a gray vapor, through which the two great eyes of the professor twinkled with a murky light. A peculiar longing stirred me, a strange yearning for something I knew not what. But oh, how I longed and yearned for it! Slowly, this indefinite, incomprehensible longing became a living pain. Ah, how I suffered, and how the vapors seemed to crowd around me. Then, as at a great distance, I heard her voice, sweet, imperative. "Mew," she said. For a moment I seemed to see the interior of my own skull, lighted as by a flash of fire. The rolling eyeballs veined in scarlet, the glistening muscles quivering along the jaw, the humid masses of the convoluted brain. Then awful darkness. a darkness almost tangible, an utter blackness, through which now seemed to creep a thin silver thread, like a river crawling across a world, like a thought gliding to the brain, like a song, a thin, sharp song, which some distant voice was singing, which I was singing. And I knew that I was mewing. I threw myself back in my chair and mewed with all my heart. Oh, that heavy load which was lifted from my breast! How good, how satisfying it was to mew! And how I did meowl and yowl! I gave myself up to it, heart and soul. My whole being thrilled with the passionate outpourings of a spirit freed. My voice trembled in the upper bars of a feline love song, quavered, descended, swelled again into an intimation that I brooked no rival, and ended with a magnificent crescendo. I finished somewhat abashed, and glanced askance at the professor and his daughter, but the one sat nonchalantly disentangling his coat-tails, and the other was apparently absorbed in the distant landscape. Evidently, they did not consider me ridiculous. Flushing painfully, I turned in my chair to see how my gruesome solo had affected the people on the terrace. Nobody even looked at me. This, however, gave me little comfort, for as I began to realize what I had done, my mortification and rage knew no bounds. I was ready to die of shame. What on earth had induced me to mew? I looked wildly about for escape. I would leap up, rush home to bury my burning face in my pillows, and later in the friendly cabin of a homeward-bound steamer. I would fly at once. Woe to the man who blocked my way. I started to my feet, but at that moment I caught Miss Wyeth's eyes fixed on mine. "Don't go," she said. What in heaven's name lay in those blue eyes? I slowly sank back into my chair. Then the professor spoke. "Wilhelmina, I have just received a despatch." "Where from, Papa?" "From India. I'm going at once." She nodded her head without turning her eyes from the sea. "Is it important, Papa?" "I should say so. The cashier of the local trust has compromised an astral body and has squandered on her all our funds, including a lot of first mortgages on Nirvana. I suppose he's been dabbling in futures and is short in his accounts. I shan't be gone long." "Then good night, Papa," she said, kissing him. "Try to be back by 11. I sat stupidly staring at them.
"Oh, it's only to Bombay. I shan't go to Tibet tonight. Good night, my dear," said the professor.
Then a singular thing occurred. The professor had at last succeeded in disentangling his coat-tails, and now, jamming his hat over his ears and waving his arms with a bat-like motion, he climbed upon the seat of his chair and ejaculated the word "Presto!" Then I found my voice. "Stop him!" I cried in terror. "Presto! Presto!" shouted the professor, balancing himself on the edge of his chair and waving his arms majestically, as if preparing for a sudden flight across the Scheldt, and firmly convinced that he not only meditated it, but was perfectly capable of attempting it, I covered my eyes with my hands. "Are you ill, Mr. Kensett?" asked the girl quietly. I raised my head indignantly. "Not at all, Miss Wyeth, only I'll bid you good evening, for this is the 19th century, and I'm a Christian." "So am I," she said. "So is my father." The devil he is, I thought. Her next words made me jump. "Please do not be profane, Mr. Kensett." How did she know I was profane? I had not spoken a word. Could it be possible she was able to read my thoughts? This was too much, and I rose. "I have the honor to bid you good evening," I began, and reluctantly turned to include the professor, expecting to see that gentleman balancing himself on his chair. The professor's chair was empty. "Oh," said the girl, smiling, "my father has gone." "Gone? Where?" To India, I believe." I sank helplessly into my own chair. "I do not think he will stay very long. He promised to return by 11, she said timidly. I tried to realize the purport of it all. Gone to India? Gone? How? On a broomstick? Good heavens, I murmured. Am I insane? Perfectly, she said, and I am tired. You may take me back to the hotel. I scarcely heard her. I was feebly attempting to gather up my numbed wits. Slowly I began to comprehend the situation, to review the startling and humiliating events of the day. At noon, in the court of the Hôtel Saint-Antoine, I had been annoyed by a man and a cat. I had retired to my own room and had slept until dinner. In the evening I met 2 tourists on the seawall promenade. I had been beguiled into conversation, yes, into intimacy with these 2 tourists. I had had the intention of embracing the faith of Pythagoras. Then I had mewed like a cat with all the strength of my lungs. Now the male tourist vanishes, and leaves me in charge of the female tourist, alone and at night in a strange city. And now the female tourist proposes that I take her home. With a remnant of self-possession, I groped for my eyeglass, seized it, screwed it firmly into my eye, and looked long and earnestly at the girl. As I looked, my eyes softened, my monocle dropped, and I forgot everything in the beauty and purity of the face before me. My heart began to beat against my stiff white waistcoat. Had I dared, yes, dared to think of this wondrous little beauty as a female tourist? Her pale, sweet face, turned towards the sea, seemed to cast a spell upon the night. How loud my heart was beating! The yellow moon floated, half dipping in the sea, flooding land and water with enchanted lights. Wind and waves seemed to feel the spell of her eyes, for the breeze died away, the heaving Scheldt tossed noiselessly, and the dark Dutch luggers swung idly on the tide, with every sail a-droop. A sudden hush fell over land and water. The voices on the promenade were stilled. Little by little, the shadowy throng, the terrace, the sea itself vanished, and I only saw her face, shadowed against the moon. It seemed as if I had drifted miles above the earth, through all space and eternity, and there was naught between me and high heaven but that white face. Ah, how I loved her! I knew it. I never doubted it. Could years of passionate adoration touch her heart? Her little heart, now beating so calmly, with no thought of love to startle it from its quiet, and send it fluttering against the gentle breast? In her lap her clasped hands tightened. Her eyelids drooped as though some pleasant thought was passing. I saw the color dye her temples. I saw the blue eyes turn, half frightened, to my own. I saw, and I knew she had read my thoughts. Then we both rose, side by side, and she was weeping softly, yet for my life I dared not speak. She turned away, touching her eyes with a bit of lace, and I sprang to her side and offered her my arm. "You cannot go back alone," I said. She did not take my arm. "Do you hate me, Miss Wyeth?" "I am very tired," she said. "I must go home." "You cannot go alone." "I do not care to accept your escort." "Then you send me away?" "No," she said in a hard voice. "You can come if you like." So I humbly attended her to the Hôtel Saint-Antoine. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 24. As we reached the Place Verte and turned into the court of the hotel, the sound of the midnight bells swept over the city, and a horse-car jingled slowly by on its last trip to the railroad station. We passed the fountain, bubbling and splashing in the moonlit court, and crossing the square, entered the southern wing of the hotel. At the foot of the stairway, she leaned for an instant against the banisters. "I am afraid we have walked too fast," I said. She turned to me coldly. "No, conventionalities must be observed. You were quite right in escaping as soon as possible." "But," I protested, "I assure you—" She gave a little movement of impatience. "Don't," she said. "You tire me. Conventionalities tire me. Be satisfied. Nobody has seen you." "You are cruel," I said in a low voice. "What do you think I care for conventionalities?" "You care everything. You care what people think, and you try to do what they say is good form. You never did such an original thing in your life as you have just done." "You read my thoughts!" I exclaimed bitterly. "It is not fair." "Fair or not, I know what you consider me. Ill-bred, common, pleased with any sort of attention. Oh, why should I waste one word, one thought on you?" "Miss Wyeth," I began, but she interrupted me. "Would you dare tell me what you think of me? Would you dare tell me what you think of my father?" I was silent. She turned and mounted 2 steps of the stairway, then faced me again. "Do you think it was for my own pleasure that I permitted myself to be left alone with you? Do you imagine that I am flattered by your attention? Do you venture to think I ever could be? How dared you think what you did think there on the sea-wall?" "I cannot help my thoughts," I replied. "You turned on me like a tiger when you awoke from your trance. Do you really suppose that you mewed? Are you not aware that my father hypnotized you?" "No, I did not know it," I said. The hot blood tingled in my fingertips, and I looked angrily at her. "Why do you imagine that I waste my time on you?" she said. "Your vanity has answered that question. Now let your intelligence answer it. I am a Pythagorean. I have been chosen to bring in a convert, and you are the convert selected for me by the Mahatmas of the Consolidated Trust Company. I have followed you from New York to Antwerp, as I was bidden, but now my courage fails, and I shrink from fulfilling my mission, knowing you to be the type of man you are. If I could give it up, if I could only go away, never, never again to see you. I fear they will not permit it. Until my mission is accomplished, why was I chosen? I, with a woman's heart and a woman's pride, I hate you." "I love you," I said slowly. She paled and looked away. "Answer me," I said. Her wide blue eyes turned back again, and I held them with mine. At last she slowly drew a long-stemmed rose from the bunch at her belt, turned and mounted the shadowy staircase. For a moment I thought I saw her pause on the landing above, but the moonlight was uncertain. After waiting for a long time in vain, I moved away, and in going raised my hand to my face. But I stopped short, and my heart stopped too for a moment. In my hand I held a long-stemmed rose. With my brain in a whirl, I crept across the court and mounted the stairs to my room. Hour after hour I walked the floor, slowly at first, then more rapidly, but it brought no calm to the fierce tumult of my thoughts, and at last I dropped into a chair before the empty fireplace, burying my head in my hands. Uncertain, shocked, and deadly weary, I tried to think. I strove to bring order out of the chaos in my brain, but I only sat staring at the long-stemmed rose. Slowly I began to take a vague pleasure in its heavy perfume, and once I crushed a leaf between my palms, and bending over drank in the fragrance. Twice my lamp flickered and went out, and twice, treading softly, I crossed the room to relight it. Twice I threw open the door, thinking that I heard some sound without. How close the air was, how heavy and hot! And what was that strange, subtle odor which had insensibly filled the room? It grew stronger and more penetrating, and I began to dislike it, and to escape it I buried my nose in the half-opened rose. Horror! The odor came from the rose, and the rose itself was no longer a rose, not even a flower now. It was only a bunch of catnip, and I dashed it to the floor and ground it under my heel. "Mountebank!" I cried in a rage. My anger grew cold, and I shivered, drawn perforce to the curtained window. Something was there, outside. I could not hear it, for it made no sound, but I knew it was there, watching me. What was it? The damp hair stirred on my head. I touched the heavy curtains. Whatever was outside them sprang up, tore at the window, and then rushed away. Feeling very shaky, I crept to the window, opened it, and leaned out. The night was calm. I heard the fountain splashing in the moonlight, and the sea wind soughing through the palms. Then I closed the window and turned back into the room. And as I stood there, a sudden breeze, which could not have come from without, blew sharply in my face, extinguishing the candle, and sending the long curtains bellying out into the room. The lamp on the table flashed and smoked and sputtered. The room was littered with flying papers and catnip leaves. Then the strange wind died away, and somewhere in the night a cat snarled. I turned desperately to my trunk and flung it open. Into it I threw everything I owned, pell-mell, closed the lid, locked it, and seizing my mackintosh and traveling bag, ran down the stairs, crossed the court, and entered the night office of the hotel. There I called up the sleepy clerk, settled my reckoning, and sent a porter for a cab. "Now," I said, "what time does the next train leave?" "The next train for where?" "Anywhere." The clerk locked the safe, and carefully keeping the desk between himself and me, motioned the office boy to look at the timetables. "Next train, 2:10, Brussels, Paris," read the boy. At that moment the cab rattled up by the curbstone, and I sprang in while the porter tossed my traps on top. Away we bumped over the stony pavement, past street after street lighted dimly by tall gas lamps, and alley after alley brilliant with the glare of villainous all-night cafe concerts. And then, turning, we rumbled past the Circus and the Eldorado, and at last stopped with a jolt before the Brussels station. I had not a moment to lose. "Paris!" I cried. "First class!" and pocketing the book of coupons, hurried across the platform to where the Brussels train lay. A guard came running up, flung open the door of a first-class carriage, slammed and locked it after I had jumped in, and the long train glided from the arched station out into the starlit morning. I was all alone in the compartment. The wretched lamp in the roof flickered dimly, scarcely lighting the stuffy box. I could not see to read my timetable, so I wrapped my legs in the traveling rug and lay back, staring out into the misty morning. Trees, walls, telegraph poles flashed past, and the cinders drove in showers against the rattling windows. I slept at times, fitfully, and once, springing up, peered sharply at the opposite seat, possessed with the idea that somebody was there. When the train reached Brussels, I was sound asleep, and the guard awoke me with difficulty. "Breakfast, sir?" he asked. "Anything," I sighed, and stepped out to the platform, rubbing my legs and shivering. The other passengers were already breakfasting in the station cafe, and I joined them and managed to swallow a cup of coffee and a roll. The morning broke grey and cloudy, and I bundled myself into my mackintosh for a tramp along the platform. Up and down I stamped, puffing a cigar, and digging my hands deep in my pockets, while the other passengers huddled into the warmer compartments of the train, or stood watching the luggage being lifted into the forward mail carriage. The wait was very long. The hands of the great clock pointed to 6, and still the train lay motionless along the platform. I approached a guard and asked him whether anything was wrong. "Accident on the line," he replied. "Monsieur had better go to his compartment and try to sleep, for we may be delayed until noon." I followed the guard's advice, and crawling into my corner, wrapped myself in the rug and lay back, watching the raindrops spattering along the window-sill. At noon the train had not moved, and I lunched in the compartment. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the station-master came hurrying along the platform, crying, "Montez, montez, monsieur, s'il vous plaît," and the train steamed out of the station and whirled away through the flat, treeless Belgian plains. At times I dozed, but the shaking of the car always awoke me, and I would sit blinking out at the endless stretch of plain until a sudden flurry of rain blotted the landscape from my eyes. At last a long, shrill whistle from the engine, a jolt, a series of bumps, and an apparition of red trousers and bayonets warned me that we had arrived at the French frontier. I turned out with the others and opened my valise for inspection, but the customs officials merely chalked it without examination, and I hurried back to my compartment amid the shouting of guards and the clanging of station bells. Again I found that I was alone in the compartment, so I smoked a cigarette, thanked heaven, and fell into a dreamless sleep. How long I slept I do not know, but when I awoke the train was roaring through a tunnel. When again it flashed out into the open country, I peered through the grimy, rain-stained window and saw that the storm had ceased and stars were twinkling in the sky. I stretched my legs, yawned, pushed my traveling cap back from my forehead, and stumbling to my feet, walked up and down the compartment until my cramped muscles were relieved. Then I sat down again, and lighting a cigar, puffed great rings and clouds of fragrant smoke across the aisle. The train was flying. The cars lurched and shook, and the windows rattled accompaniment to the creaking panels. The smoke from my cigar dimmed the lamp in the ceiling and hid the opposite seat from view. How it curled and writhed in the corners, now eddying upward, now floating across the aisle like a veil. I lounged back in my cushioned seat, watching it with interest. What queer shapes it took! How thick it was becoming! How strangely luminous! Now it had filled the whole compartment, puff after puff crowding upward, waving, wavering, clouding the windows, and blotting the lamp from sight. It was most interesting. I had never before smoked such a cigar. What an extraordinary brand! I examined the end, flicking the ashes away. The cigar was out. Fumbling for a match to relight it, my eyes fell on the drifting smoke curtain, which swayed across the corner opposite. It seemed almost tangible. How like a real curtain it hung, gray, impenetrable. A man might hide behind it. Then an idea came into my head, and it persisted until my uneasiness amounted to a vague terror. I tried to fight it off. I strove to resist. But the conviction slowly settled upon me that something was behind that smoke veil. Something which had entered the compartment while I slept. "It can't be," I muttered, my eyes fixed on the misty drapery. "The train has not stopped." The car creaked and trembled. I sprang to my feet and swept my arm through the veil of smoke. Then my hair rose on my head, for my hand touched another hand, and my eyes had met two other eyes. I heard a voice in the gloom, low and sweet, calling me by name. I saw the eyes again, tender and blue. Soft fingers touched my own. "Are you afraid?" she said. My heart began to beat again, and my face warmed with returning blood. "It is only I," she said gently. I seemed to hear my own voice, speaking as if at a great distance. "You here? Alone?" "How cruel of you!" she faltered. "I am not alone." At the same instant, my eyes fell upon the professor, calmly seated by the farther window. His hands were thrust into the folds of a corded and tasseled dressing gown, from beneath which peeped two enormous feet encased in carpet slippers. Upon his head towered a yellow nightcap. He did not pay the slightest attention to either me or his daughter, and except for the lighted cigar which he kept shifting between his lips, he might have been taken for a wax dummy. Then I began to speak, feebly, hesitating like a child. "How did you come into this compartment? You do not possess wings, I suppose. You could not have been here all the time. Will you explain to me? See, I ask you very humbly, for I do not understand. This is the 19th century, and these things don't fit in. I'm wearing a Dunlap hat. I've got a copy of the New York Herald in my bag. President Roosevelt is alive, and everything is so very unromantic in the world. Is this real magic? Perhaps I'm filled with hallucinations. Perhaps I'm asleep and dreaming. Perhaps you are not really here, nor I, nor anybody, nor anything." The train plunged into a tunnel, and when again it dashed out from the other end, the cold wind blew furiously in my face from the farther window. It was wide open. The professor was gone. "Papa has changed to another compartment," she said quietly. "I think perhaps you are beginning to bore him." Her eyes met mine, and she smiled. "Are you very much bewildered?" I looked at her in silence. She sat very quietly, her hands clasped above her knee, her curly hair glittering to her girdle. A long robe, almost silvery in the twilight, clung to her young figure. Her bare feet were thrust deep into a pair of shimmering Eastern slippers. "When you fled," she sighed, "I was asleep, and there was no time to lose. I barely had a moment to go to Bombay to find Papa, and return in time to join you. This is an East Indian costume." Still I was silent. "Are you shocked?" she asked simply. No, I replied in a dull voice. I'm past that. You are very rude, she said, with the tears starting to her eyes. I do not mean to be. I only wish to go away somewhere, and find out what my name is. Your name is Harold Kensett. Are you sure? I asked eagerly. Yes. What troubles you? Is everything plain to you? Are you a sort of prophet and second sight medium? Is nothing hidden from you? I asked. Nothing, she faltered. My head ached, and I clasped it in my hand. A sudden change came over her. I am human, believe me, she said, with piteous eagerness. Indeed, I do not seem strange to those who understand. You wonder because you left me at midnight in Antwerp, and you wake to find me here. If, because I find myself reincarnated, endowed with senses and capabilities which few at present possess, if I am so made, why should it seem strange? It is all so natural to me. If I appear to you... Appear? Yes. Wilhelmina, I cried, can you vanish? Yes, she murmured. Does it seem to you unmaidenly? Great heaven, I groaned. Don't, she cried, with tears in her voice. Oh, please don't. Help me to bear it. If you only knew how awful it is to be different from other girls, how mortifying it is to me to be able to vanish. Oh, how I hate and detest it all. Don't cry, I said, looking at her pityingly. Oh, dear me, she sobbed. You shudder at the sight of me because I can vanish. I don't, I cried. Yes, you do. You abhor me. You shrink away. Oh, why did I ever see you? Why did you ever come into my life? What have I done in ages past that now, reborn, I suffer cruelly, cruelty? What do you mean? I whispered. My voice trembled with happiness. I? Nothing, but you think me a fabled monster. Wilhelmina, my sweet Wilhelmina, I said, I don't think you a fabled monster. I love you. See, I am at your feet. Listen to me, my darling. She turned her blue eyes to mine. I saw tears sparkling on the curved lashes. Wilhelmina, I love you, I said again. Slowly she raised her hands to my head and held it a moment, looking at me strangely. Then her face grew nearer to my own. Her glittering hair fell over my shoulders. Her lips rested on mine. In that long, sweet kiss, the beating of her heart answered mine, and I learned 1,000 truths, wonderful, mysterious, splendid. But when our lips fell apart, the memory of what I learned departed also. It was so very simple and beautiful, she sighed, and I never saw it. But the Mahatmas knew. They knew that my mission could only be accomplished through love. And it is, I whispered, for you shall teach me, your husband. And you will not be impatient? You will try to believe? I will believe what you tell me, my sweetheart. Even about cats? Before I could reply, the farther window opened, and a yellow nightcap, followed by the professor, entered from somewhere without. Wilhelmina sank back on her sofa, but the professor needed not to be told, and we both knew he was already busily reading our thoughts. For a moment there was dead silence, long enough for the professor to grasp the full significance of what had passed. Then he uttered a single exclamation.
"Oh."
After a while, however, he looked at me for the first time that evening, saying,
"Congratulate you, Mr. Kensett, I'm sure,"
tied several knots in the cord of his dressing gown, lighted a cigar, and paid no further attention to either of us. Some moments later he opened the window again and disappeared. I looked across the aisle at Wilhelmina. "You may come over beside me," she said shyly. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Eastman. Chapter 25. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and our train was rapidly approaching Paris. We passed village after village, wrapped in mist, station after station, hung with twinkling red and blue and yellow lanterns, then sped on again, with the echo of the switch bells ringing in our ears. When at length the train slowed up and stopped, I opened the window and looked out upon a long, wet platform, shining under the electric lights. A guard came running by, throwing open the doors of each compartment and crying, "Paris next! Tickets, if you please!" I handed him my book of coupons, from which he tore several and handed it back. Then he lifted his lantern and peered into the compartment, saying, "Is Monsieur alone?" I turned to Wilhelmina. "He wants your ticket. Give it to me."
"What's that?"
demanded the guard. I looked anxiously at Wilhelmina. "If your father has the tickets," I began, but was interrupted by the guard, who snapped, "Monsieur will give himself the trouble to remember that I do not understand English." "Keep quiet," I said sharply in French. "I am not speaking to you." The guard stared stupidly at me, then at my luggage, and finally, entering the car, knelt down and peered under the seats. Presently he got up, very red in the face, and went out slamming the door. He had not paid the slightest attention to Wilhelmina, but I distinctly heard him say, "Only Englishmen and idiots talk to themselves." "Wilhelmina," I faltered, "do you mean to say that that guard could not see you?" She began to look so serious again that I merely added, "Never mind, I don't care whether you are invisible or not, dearest." "I am not invisible to you," she said. "Why should you care?" A great noise of bells and whistles drowned our voices, and amid the whirring of switch bells, the hissing of steam, and the cries of "Paris, all out!" our train glided into the station. It was the professor who opened the door of our carriage. There he stood, calmly adjusting his yellow nightcap and drawing his dressing gown closer with the corded tassels. "Where have you been?" I asked.
"On the engine."
"In the engine, I suppose you mean," I said.
"No, I don't. I mean on the engine. On the pilot. It was very refreshing. Where are we going now?"
"Do you know Paris?" asked Wilhelmina, turning to me. "Yes. I think your father had better take you to the Hôtel Normandy on the Rue de l'Echelle." "But you must stay there too." "Of course, if you wish." She laughed nervously. "Don't you see that my father and I could not take rooms, now? You must engage 3 rooms for yourself." "Why?" I asked stupidly. "Oh dear, why, because we are invisible." I tried to repress a shudder. The professor gave Wilhelmina his arm, and as I studied his ensemble, I thanked heaven that he was invisible. At the gate of the station, I hailed a 4-seated cab, and we rattled away through the stony streets, brilliant with gas jets, and in a few moments rolled smoothly across the Avenue de l'Opéra, turned into the Rue de l'Echelle, and stopped. A bright little page, all over buttons, came out, took my luggage, and preceded us into the hallway. I, with Wilhelmina on my arm and the professor shuffling along beside me, walked over to the desk. "Room," said the clerk. "We have a very desirable room on the second, fronting the Rue Saint-Honoré. But that is, I want 3 rooms, 3 separate rooms," I said. The clerk scratched his chin. "Monsieur is expecting friends?" "Say yes," whispered Wilhelmina, with a suspicion of laughter in her voice. "Yes," I repeated feebly. "Gentlemen, of course," said the clerk, looking at me narrowly. "1 lady." "Married, of course." "What's that to you?" I said sharply. "What do you mean by speaking to us? Us?" "I mean to me," I said, badly rattled. "Give me the rooms and let me get to bed, will you?" "Monsieur will remember," said the clerk coldly, "that this is an old and respectable hotel." "I know it," I said, smothering my rage. The clerk eyed me suspiciously. "Front," he called, with irritating deliberation. "Show this gentleman to apartment 10. "How many rooms are there?" I demanded. 3 sleeping rooms and a parlor." "I will take it," I said, with composure. "On probation," muttered the clerk insolently. Swallowing the insult, I followed the bellboy up the stairs, keeping between him and Wilhelmina, for I dreaded to see him walk through her as if she were thin air. A trim maid rose to meet us and conducted us through a hallway into a large apartment. She threw open all the bedroom doors and said, "Will monsieur have the goodness to choose?" "Which will you take?" I began, turning to Wilhelmina. "I? Monsieur!" cried the startled maid. That completely upset me. "Here," I muttered, slipping some silver into her hand. "Now, for the love of heaven, run away." When she had vanished with a doubtful "Merci, monsieur," I handed the professor the keys and asked him to settle the thing with Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina took the corner room, the professor rambled into the next one, and I said good night and crept wearily into my own chamber. I sat down and tried to think. A great feeling of fatigue weighed my spirits. "I can think better with my clothes off," I said, and slipped the coat from my shoulders. How tired I was. "I can think better in bed," I muttered, flinging my cravat on the dresser and tossing my shirt studs after it. I was certainly very tired. "Now," I yawned, grasping the pillow and drawing it under my head, "now I can think a bit." But before my head fell on the pillow, sleep closed my eyes. I began to dream at once. It seemed as though my eyes were wide open, and the professor was standing beside my bed. "Young man," he said, "you've won my daughter, and you must pay the piper." "What piper?" I said. "The Pied Piper of Hamelin, I don't know," replied the professor vulgarly. And before I could realize what he was doing, he had drawn a reed pipe from his dressing-gown, and was playing a strangely annoying air. Then an awful thing occurred. Cats began to troop into the room, cats by the 100. Toms and tabbies, grey, yellow, Maltese, Persian, Manx, all purring and all marching round and round, rubbing against the furniture, the professor, and even against me. I struggled with the nightmare. "Take them away!" I tried to gasp. "Nonsense," he said. "Here is an old friend." I saw the white tabby cat of the Hôtel Saint-Antoine. "An old friend," he repeated, and played a dismal melody on his reed. I saw Wilhelmina enter the room, lift the white tabby in her arms, and bring her to my side. "Shake hands with him," she commanded. To my horror, the tabby deliberately extended a paw and tapped me on the knuckles. "Oh!" I cried in agony. "This is a horrible dream! Why, oh, why can't I wake?" "Yes," she said, dropping the cat, "it is partly a dream, but some of it is real. Remember what I say, my darling. You are to go tomorrow morning and meet the 12 o'clock train from Antwerp at the Gare du Nord. Papa and I are coming to Paris on that train. Don't you know that we are not really here now, you silly boy? Good night, then. I shall be very glad to see you." I saw her glide from the room, followed by the professor, playing a gay quick-step, to which the cats danced 2 and 2. "Good night, sir," said each cat as it passed my bed. And I dreamed no more. When I awoke, the room, the bed had vanished. I was in the street, walking rapidly. The sun shone down on the broad white pavements of Paris, and the streams of busy life flowed past me on either side. How swiftly I was walking! Where the devil was I going? Surely I had business somewhere that needed immediate attention. I tried to remember when I had awakened, but I could not. I wondered where I had dressed myself. I had apparently taken great pains with my toilet, for I was immaculate, monocle and all, even down to a long-stemmed rose nestling in my buttonhole. I knew Paris and recognized the streets through which I was hurrying. Where could I be going? What was my hurry? I glanced at my watch and found I had not a moment to lose. Then, as the bells of the city rang out midday, I hastened into the railroad station on the Rue Lafayette and walked out to the platform. And as I looked down the glittering track, around the distant curve shot a locomotive, followed by a long line of cars. Nearer and nearer it came, while the station gong sounded and the switch bells began ringing all along the track. "Antwerp Express!" cried the sous-chef de gare, and as the train slipped along the tiled platform, I sprang upon the steps of a first-class carriage and threw open the door. "How do you do, Mr. Kensett?" said Wilhelmina Wyeth, springing lightly to the platform. "Really, it is very nice of you to come to the train." At the same moment, a bald, mild-eyed gentleman emerged from the depths of the same compartment, carrying a large covered basket. "How are you, Kensett?" he said. "Glad to see you again. Rather warm in that compartment. No, I will not trust this basket to an expressman. Give Wilhelmina your arm, and I'll follow. We go to the Normandy, I believe." All the morning I had Wilhelmina to myself, and at dinner I sat beside her, with the professor opposite. The latter was cheerful enough, but he nearly ruined my appetite, for he smelled strongly of catnip. After dinner he became restless, and fidgeted about in his chair until coffee was brought, and we went up to the parlor of our apartment. Here his restlessness increased to such an extent that I ventured to ask him if he was in good health. "It's that basket, the covered basket, which I have in the next room," he said. "What's the trouble with the basket?" I asked. "The basket's all right, but the contents worry me." "May I inquire what the contents are?" I ventured. The professor rose. "Yes," he said, "you may inquire of my daughter." He left the room, but reappeared shortly, carrying a saucer of milk. I watched him enter the next room, which was mine. "What on earth is he taking that into my room for?" I asked Wilhelmina. "I don't keep cats." "But you will," she said. "I? Never." "You will if I ask you to." But you won't ask me." "But I do." "Wilhelmina!" Harold, I detest cats. You must not. I can't help it. You will when I ask it. Have I not given myself to you? Will you not make a little sacrifice for me?
I don't understand.
Would you refuse my first request?
No, I said miserably. I will keep dozens of cats.
I do not ask that. I only wish you to keep one.
Was that what your father had in that basket? I asked suspiciously.
Yes, the basket came from Antwerp. What? The white Antwerp cat? I cried. Yes. And you ask me to keep that cat? Oh, Wilhelmina! Listen, she said. I have a long story to tell you. Come nearer, close to me. You say you love me.
I bent and kissed her.
Then I shall put you to the proof, she murmured.
Prove me.
Listen, that cat is the same cat that ran out of the apartment in the Waldorf when your great-aunt ceased to exist, in human shape. My father and myself, having received word from the Mahatmas of the Trust Company, sheltered and cherished the cat. We were ordered by the Mahatmas to convert you. The task was appalling, but there is no such thing as refusing a command, and we laid our plans. That man with a white spot in his hair was my father. What? Your father is bald. He wore a wig then. The white spot came from dropping chemicals on the wig while experimenting with a substance which you could not comprehend. Then that clue was useless. But who could have taken the crimson diamond? And who is the man with the white spot on his head who tried to sell the stone in Paris? That was my father. He took the crimson diamond? I cried, aghast. Yes and no. That was only a paste stone that he had in Paris. It was to draw you over here. He had the real crimson diamond also.
Your father?
Yes, he has it in the next room now. Can you not see how it disappeared, Harold? Why, the cat swallowed it. Do you mean to say that the white tabby swallowed the crimson diamond? By mistake. She tried to get it out of the velvet bag, and as the bag was also full of catnip, she could not resist a mouthful, and unfortunately just then you broke in the door, and so startled the cat that she swallowed the crimson diamond.
There was a painful pause. At last I said, Wilhelmina, as you are able to vanish, I suppose you also are able to converse with cats?
I am,
she replied, trying to keep back the tears of mortification.
And that cat told you this?
She did. And my crimson diamond is inside that cat?
It is.
Then, said I firmly, I am going to chloroform the cat.
Harold, she cried in terror, that cat is your great-aunt.
I don't know to this day how I stood the shock of that announcement, or how I managed to listen while Wilhelmina tried to explain the transmigration theory, but it was all Chinese to me. I only knew that I was a blood relation of a cat, and the thought nearly drove me mad.
Try, my darling, try to love her, whispered Wilhelmina. She must be very precious to you.
Yes, with my diamond inside her, I replied faintly.
You must not neglect her, said Wilhelmina.
Oh, no, I'll always have my eye on her. I will surround her with luxury. Milk and bones and catnip and books.
Does she read? Not the books that human beings read. Now go and speak to your aunt, Harold. Eh? How the deuce? Go. For my sake, try to be cordial.
She rose and led me unresistingly to the door of my room. "Good heavens!" I groaned. "This is awful!" "Courage, my darling," she whispered. "Be brave for love of me." I drew her to me and kissed her. Beads of cold perspiration started in the roots of my hair, but I clenched my teeth and entered the room alone. The room was dark, and I stood silent, not knowing where to turn, fearful lest I step on my aunt. Then, through the dreary silence, I called, "Auntie!" A faint noise broke upon my ear, and my heart grew sick, but I strode into the darkness, calling hoarsely, "Aunt Tabby, it is your nephew!" Again the faint sound. Something was stirring there among the shadows. A shape moving softly along the wall, a shade which glided by me, paused, wavered, and darted under the bed. Then I threw myself on the floor, profoundly moved, begging, imploring my aunt to come to me. "Auntie, auntie," I murmured, "your nephew is waiting to take you to his heart." At last I saw my great-aunt's eyes shining in the dark. The young man's voice grew hushed and solemn, and he lifted his hand in silence. "Close the door. That meeting is not for the eyes of the world. Close the door upon that sacred scene where great-aunt and nephew are united at last." A long pause followed. Deep emotion was visible in Miss Barrison's sensitive face. She said, "Then you are married?" "No," replied Mr. Kensett, in a mortified voice. "Why not?" I asked, amazed. "Because," he said, "although my fiancée was prepared to accept a cat as her great-aunt, she could not endure the complications that followed." "What complications?" inquired Miss Barrison. The young man sighed profoundly, shaking his head. "My great-aunt had kittens," he said softly. The tremendous scientific importance of these experiences excited me beyond measure. The simplicity of the narrative, the elaborate attention to corroborative detail, all bore irresistible testimony to the truth of these accounts, of phenomena vitally important to the entire world of science. We all dined together that night, a little earnest company of knowledge-seekers in the vast wilderness of the unexplored, and we lingered long in the dining-car, propounding questions, advancing theories, speculating upon possibilities of most intense interest. Never before had I known a man whose relatives were cats and kittens, but he did not appear to share my enthusiasm in the matter. "You see," he said, looking at Miss Barrison, "it may be interesting from a purely scientific point of view, but it has already proved a bar to my marrying." "Were the kittens black?" I inquired. "No," he said. "My aunt drew the color line, I am proud to say." "I don't see," said Miss Barrison, "why the fact that your great-aunt is a cat should prevent you from marrying." "It wouldn't prevent me," said the young man quickly. "Nor me," mused Miss Barrison, "if I were really in love." Meanwhile, I had been very busy thinking about Professor Farrago, and coming to an interesting theory, advanced it. "If," I began, "he marries one of those transparent ladies, what about the children?" "Some would be, no doubt, transparent," said Kensett. "They might be only translucent," suggested Miss Barrison. "Or partially opaque," I ventured, "but it's a risky marriage, not to be able to see what one's wife is about." "That is a silly reflection on women," said Miss Barrison quietly. "Besides, A girl need not be transparent to conceal what she's doing. This observation seemed to end our postprandial and tripartite conference. Miss Barrison retired to her stateroom presently. After a last cigar, smoked almost in silence, the young man and I bade each other a civil good night, and retired to our respective berths. I think it was at Richmond, Virginia, that I was awakened by the negro porter shaking me very gently and repeating in a pleasant, monotonous voice, "Telegram for you, sir. Telegram for Mr. Gillon, sir. Done call you 11 times since breakfast, sir. Last call for luncheon, sir. Telegram for—" "Heavens!" I muttered, sitting up in my bunk. "Is it as late as that? Where are we?" I slid up the window shade and sat blinking at a flood of sunshine. "Telegram," I said, yawning and rubbing my eyes. "Let me have it. All right, I'll be out presently. Shut that curtain. I don't want the entire car to criticize my pink pajamas."
"Ain't nobody in de kyar, 'scusin' yourself, sir," grinned the porter, retiring.
I heard him, but did not comprehend, sitting there sleepily unfolding the scrawled telegram. Suddenly, my eyes flew wide open. I scanned the despatch with stunned incredulity. Atlanta, Georgia. We couldn't help it. Love at first sight. Married this morning in Atlanta. Wildly happy. Forgive. Wire blessing. Signed, Harold Kensett, Helen Barrison Kensett. "Porter!" I shouted. "Porter, help!" There was no response. "Oh, Lord!" I groaned, and rolled over, burying my head in the blankets. For I understood at last that science, the most jealous, most exacting of mistresses, could never brook a rival. End of chapter 25. End of In Search of the Unknown by Robert W. Chambers. Recorded by Peter Eastman, 2018. Thank you for listening.